The Vulture did not belong to that field. Not in the way the swallows belonged to the fence line. Not in the way the crows belonged to the power poles. Not even in the way stray dogs belonged to the road that led nowhere in particular. This bird was too large, too patient, too certain. It wheeled in a slow circle over a rectangle of forgotten ground, as if the air itself had been marked with invisible chalk. People noticed because the field was a place people rarely noticed. It sat behind the last row of houses, past a stand of thin poplars and a drainage ditch that never fully dried. From the road, it looked like any other patch of rural land. Grass gone pale, weeds thick, the kind of field that used to be productive before the town's edges changed shape and the farming families got old. The official maps still named it by an outdated parcel number. The locals called it the Quiet Field. Some said that name like a joke. Others said it like a warning. On the first morning, anyone admitted the Vulture had become a pattern. The sky was a hard, clean blue. The air smelled faintly of dust and leaf mold. A tractor moved on a neighboring plot, its engine sound steady and indifferent. Over the quiet field, the Vulture circled as if it had nothing else to do for the rest of its life. Milo Havel watched from the shoulder of the road, one boot in the ditch grass and one on gravel, holding a paper cup of coffee that was already cooling. Milo was not the sort of person who liked mysteries. He liked schedules. He liked receipts. He liked the way an electrical panel looked when everything had been labeled correctly. He also liked animals, in the practical way you like things that belong to the world and don't lie. Milo worked for the municipality as a maintenance technician, which meant his days were mostly light fixtures, water pumps, broken locks, and the occasional sewage line issue that turned a normal morning into an afternoon that smelled like regret. He had learned to look for patterns because patterns were how you found the real problem behind the visible one. A vulture circling a field for 3 days was a pattern. It wasn't alone in the sky either. 2 crows hung back, not close enough to challenge, not far enough to leave. When the vulture dipped, they followed its movement like smaller satellites orbiting something heavy. Milo had come out because his neighbor, an old woman who lived alone with a cat and an endless supply of unasked-for opinions, had told him it was circling like the old days. Milo had asked what she meant. She had not answered directly. She never did. She'd just looked past him, toward the quiet field, and said the bird was bringing something back up. That phrase bothered Milo more than it should have. Bringing something back up. Like a memory. Like a body. Like a buried mistake. He told himself it was nonsense. Still, he watched. The vulture made another slow loop. It didn't dive, didn't land, didn't seem interested in any obvious carcass. No dead deer, no roadkill, no scattered bones, just circling, holding height, returning to the same center point as if the air above that patch of ground had a magnet in it. A jogger passed and slowed, head tilted up. A dog walker stopped, dog nose down, tail stiff, pulling toward the ditch as if it smelled something under the wet grass. Milo felt, unpleasantly, that the field was not quiet at all. It was simply silent in a way that was deliberate. That afternoon, Milo did what he always did when something felt off and nobody seemed to care. He documented it. He walked the edge of the field with his phone out and his eyes down. He took pictures of the ditch line, the weeds, the faint tire ruts that didn't belong to any modern tractor. The old fence posts, half rotted, but still standing in the corners like leftovers from another era. He found nothing, but the smell returned. It wasn't the blunt rot of a dead animal. It was thinner, colder. The smell of damp earth that had been disturbed too recently, mixed with something faintly metallic, like old water in a rusted bucket. Milo crouched by the ditch and ran his fingers through the wet grass. The soil was soft, more saturated than it should have been after a week without rain. When he lifted his hand, mud clung to his skin in a slick layer, darker than the surrounding earth. He looked out across the field. In the center, the weeds grew in a slightly different pattern, thicker, taller, as if feeding on a richer seam beneath. It could have been coincidence. It could have been where water pooled. It could have been nothing at all. The Vulture traced another circle. On impulse, Milo did something he didn't usually do. He stepped off the shoulder and into the field. The ground accepted his weight with a damp give. Not sinking, not boggy, just receptive. He walked slowly, scanning for anything that looked like a burrow, a carcass, a patch of broken earth. The weeds brushed his jeans, leaving tiny seeds and burrs like stubborn punctuation. Halfway to the center, he felt it, a soft, wrong dip under his boot. He froze, shifted weight back, and looked down. The weeds were thick here, but the ground beneath had a subtle concavity, almost like a shallow footprint the size of a small bathtub. He took a step sideways and felt another slight give. This wasn't a natural animal hole, not a fox den, not a badger run. The depression was too broad, too evenly shaped. Milo's skin tightened. He stepped back toward the edge of the field and looked up. The Vulture had lowered its circle. It was closer there now, big enough that Milo could see the pale head, the hooked beak, the lazy certainty of its flight. It was watching. Milo left the field and walked straight home, his coffee long forgotten, his brain already doing the thing it did when something couldn't be unseen. At his kitchen table, he pulled up the local parcel map online. The Quiet Fields parcel number came up with a name attached, an owner who had died years ago, an estate tangled in paperwork, a plot that nobody was in a hurry to claim. Milo scrolled back through old municipal records, looking for any notes. One line in an outdated document caught his eye. Restricted agricultural use due to subsoil anomaly. No explanation, no details, just that. Milo read it twice, then a third time, and felt his stomach drop a fraction. He called the municipal office. The clerk told him, politely, that they had no idea what that meant. Those records were old, pre-digital, probably a clerical remark. Milo hung up and sat there, tapping his thumb against the table, thinking about the way the ground had dipped under his boot. By evening, the Vulture was still there. People were talking, not formally, not in meetings, but in that soft, sideways way towns communicate when they don't want to name the thing. A teacher mentioned it at the bakery. A mechanic joked about the field being cursed. A teenager posted a shaky video of the bird circling and asked if anyone else thought it was weird. The comments were the usual mix. Cool bird, leave it alone, probably a dead rabbit, town people overreacting. Then one comment appeared from an account with no profile picture and a name that looked like a real name. Stop going into that field. The next morning, Milo went back anyway. He arrived early before the school bus, before the dog walkers, when the air was still and the dew made the weeds sparkle like cheap jewelry. The vulture was already circling, as if it had spent the night overhead. Milo stood at the edge and watched the center of the field. The weeds moved slightly in a breeze. Nothing else. He brought a long metal rod, one of the simple probe tools he used for checking soil depth near water lines. He didn't think of it as a weapon. He thought of it as a tool that would give him information without forcing him to dig like a panicked amateur. He stepped into the field, moved toward the depression, and pushed the rod into the soil. It went in easily at first, then met resistance. Not rock, not hard clay. Something dense, about half a meter down. Milo pulled the rod out. Mud coated the tip, darker than before. He wiped it against a weed stalk and saw a smear that looked almost black. His heart thudded once, hard. He tested another spot, a meter away. Same pattern, easy soil, then resistance. Another meter. Same. He traced a rough rectangle. Whatever was beneath, it was not a single object. It was a filled area, and it was close to the surface. Milo stepped back, looked up, and saw that the vulture had tightened its circle again. It wasn't diving. It didn't need to. It had already found what it wanted. Milo did not call Municipal Public Works again. He skipped that step. He called County Environmental Services because they were the only office that responded quickly when a problem smelled like liability. He didn't say war crime. He didn't say body. He said calmly that there was unusual wildlife behavior, possible contamination, and an area of disturbed subsoil on a neglected parcel. That phrasing did two things. It made the call sound reasonable. It also made it sound like a problem someone would be blamed for if they ignored it. A technician named Arlen called him back within an hour. Arlen asked questions. Milo answered carefully. Arlen asked if Milo had dug. Milo said no. Arlen told him to stay off the field and to keep others away if he could, and that someone would arrive by afternoon. Milo walked back to the edge of the quiet field and stood there with his arms crossed, feeling absurd, like a man guarding a secret he didn't want. By noon, 2 county vehicles arrived. They parked on the shoulder. 3 people stepped out. Arlen, a woman named Sarah with a case of sampling equipment, and a third person who didn't introduce himself, but moved like someone who had worked scenes that had gone bad before. They walked the field edge, noted the vulture, noted the crows, noted the dog pulling toward the ditch. Arlen asked Milo to point to the depression. Milo did. Sarah crouched at the edge of the dip and pressed a gloved hand into the soil. She didn't smile. She didn't say anything comforting. She simply looked up at Arlen and nodded slightly, as if confirming an internal suspicion. They did not start digging. They started mapping. Arlen pulled out a handheld GPS and began marking points along the depression. The third person took pictures with a clinical rhythm. Sarah inserted a probe of her own, different from Milo's, designed to extract a small core sample without disturbing too much. When she pulled it up, the core was dark and wet, with a faint smell that made Milo's throat tighten. Arlen kept his voice neutral. This was not a normal soil profile. This was fill. Fill meant something had been placed here. Milo watched, trying not to imagine too specifically. His mind kept producing images anyway. Shovels, darkness, something heavy, hands pushing earth. The third person stepped aside and made a call. Milo caught fragments. Forensic unit, historical remains, need an officer. Those words turned Milo's uncomfortable curiosity into a cold, heavy certainty. By late afternoon, the field was no longer quiet. A police car arrived, then another. Tape went up, and for a moment, Milo thought bitterly about how quickly the world moved once someone in a uniform acknowledged the same oddness he'd seen. A small group gathered at the road, neighbors, dog walkers, two teenagers with their phones held too high. Rumors moved faster than the Vulture. Someone said they'd found a body. Someone said it was a dump site. Someone said it was an old cow pit from the slaughterhouse days. Someone else, quietly, said it was from the war. Milo turned toward that voice. It belonged to an older man with a flat cap and a face like weathered wood. Milo knew him as Dusan, a retired rail worker who rarely spoke in public. When Dusan spoke, people listened because his silence had always seemed intentional. Dusan didn't elaborate. He just stared at the field, then down at his hands, then back up. The Vulture continued circling overhead, almost offended that humans had arrived to claim what it had found. By the next morning, a forensic team arrived with equipment that made the scene feel official in the way official things always feel. Tents, lights, measuring tools, white suits, someone with a clipboard. They moved with purpose and caution. No dramatic announcements, no sensational gestures. They began digging in a grid. At first, it was just soil, weeds cut away, earth scooped out in careful layers. They used small tools, not shovels. They documented every centimeter. Then they hit a layer that wasn't natural. A compacted seam of clay mixed with ash and gravel poured deliberately. A kind of cap. Milo stood behind the tape, watching, his stomach tight, his hands cold. The lead forensic anthropologist, Dr. Nessa Klein, spoke briefly with the police chief. Milo couldn't hear words, but he could read posture. The slight stiffness of shoulders, the way the chief's jaw set. When they breached the cap, the smell changed. It wasn't the smell of something freshly dead. It was older, like damp wood and rust and soil that had held something for too long. The team slowed down. A gloved hand brushed away a layer of earth and revealed something pale. Bone. Not a single bone. A curve. A fragment. The edge of a skull. The field's history, whatever it was, had just come up through the surface in a language nobody could pretend not to understand. The Vulture circled lower. Milo wanted to look away. He didn't. He couldn't. The first day of excavation ended without a full reveal, but everyone knew enough now that the town's mood shifted. It wasn't gossip anymore. It was fear, and something else. A quiet shame that settled like dust. In the days that followed, more remains were uncovered. The careful grid expanded. The rectangle Milo had traced with a rod grew into a mapped site, a controlled dig, a forensic recovery. They found at least 7 individuals in the first section. Then more. The bodies had been placed in layers, not tossed randomly. That detail mattered. It meant planning. It meant intention. It meant someone had taken time to do this. Dr. Klein's team documented everything: bone position, soil layers, artifacts. Artifacts were the worst part in a way, because artifacts made the dead feel like people again. A rusted belt buckle, a button, a small piece of cloth that had survived because it had been pressed against clay. And then, on the 3rd day, they found a metal tag. Not a dog tag exactly, but a stamped identification plate, the kind used in certain military units decades earlier. It bore a serial number and a symbol that Milo didn't recognize. The police chief called in a representative from the National War Crimes Office. That sentence, when Milo heard it, felt surreal. War Crimes Office. In his town. At this field behind the last row of houses where kids used to cut through on bikes. A war crime was something that happened in documentaries, in distant places with names that came with heavy music and archival footage. Not here. But the earth didn't care what Milo had believed about where cruelty belonged. A week into the excavation, the national investigator arrived. Her name was Lena Varga. She didn't wear a dramatic coat or speak in rehearsed statements. She moved like a person who had learned not to waste energy reacting to horror in public. Lena asked to see the site. She asked to see the artifacts. She asked to see the identification plate. Then she asked for the town records, not the polite municipal records, the old ones, the ones kept in boxes, the ones nobody liked to open because paper carries its own kind of accusation. The mayor, under pressure, authorized access. Volunteers and clerks dragged out dusty files. Milo watched them in the municipal hall, stacks of folders that smelled like old glue and damp cardboard. People flipped through them with nervous fingers. Somewhere in that paperwork was the story the field had been trying to keep quiet. It didn't take long to find hints. During the war, nearly 80 years earlier, the town had sat near an occupied border zone. It had changed hands, technically, more than once. There had been factions. There had been militias. There had been collaborators. There had been resistance groups. Everyone in the region knew the broad strokes. What they didn't talk about were the nights, the forgotten lists, the disappearances that never became public mourning, because public mourning was dangerous at the time. Lena found an old incident report, handwritten, dated near the end of the conflict. It referenced unauthorized detention of civilians and missing persons last seen near the rail spur. The rail spur ran, years ago, close to the quiet field. Dusan, the old rail worker, had been right to go silent when he spoke. Rail lines remember everything. They don't move. They just collect footsteps. Lena requested interviews, not press interviews, quiet interviews. People in their kitchens, in municipal offices, in nursing homes where memories live half in the past anyway. Dusan was on her list. Dusan initially refused. Everyone heard that. It traveled like a rumor. Then, one evening, Dusan's niece convinced him to go. He met Lena at the municipal hall after hours. The lights were dim. The building felt too modern for what he was about to say. Dusan told her about a night when he was a young apprentice. He had been sent to the rail yard to check a switch. He had seen trucks by lantern light. He had seen men standing in the shadows, rifles slung casually like tools. He had heard muffled voices from the back of a covered vehicle. He hadn't approached. He hadn't asked questions. He had done what you did to survive. He had pretended not to see. The trucks had driven toward the quiet field. Later, he had heard shots in the distance. Not a battle, a sequence, a controlled rhythm. Then silence. The next day, older men at the yard had warned him never to speak of it. The field had been closed off for military use. A small sign had gone up for a time, then vanished. After the war, the land had returned to civilian records, but nobody had plowed the center again. People used the edges. They avoided the middle. Dusan said in a voice that barely held steady that he had always known something was there. He had simply learned to live around it. Lena wrote everything down. Dr. Klein's team continued recovering remains. As the excavation expanded, the count increased. 14, then 19, then 23. Not all in one pit. Multiple adjacent trenches, connected by the same cap layer and the same soil disturbances. The quiet field was not a single burial. It was a site, a deliberate site. On day 11, they found evidence that shifted the case from unknown deaths to crime. A bullet casing, then another, then several, embedded in the soil near skull fragments. The casings were from the same weapon type. The spacing suggested people had been shot at close range, likely lined up, likely executed. No dramatic speculation was needed. The physical evidence spoke in a flat, undeniable tone. The town reacted in stages, like people do when a truth arrives too large. At first, denial. It must have been soldiers. It must have been accident. It must have been a plague burial. Then bargaining. It was war. Everyone did terrible things. The past is complicated. Then anger. Why now? Why here? Why dig it up? Why bring shame? Then, for some, a kind of numb grief. Because a mass grave is not just a crime scene. It is a hole in a community story where something was forced to disappear. As the investigation tightened, Lena asked for a list of missing persons from that era. That list existed in fragments, church records, family diaries, old letters. The official registry was incomplete because official registries often are when the state has been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again. Families came forward anyway. A woman in her 70s brought a photo of a young man who had disappeared when she was a child. She had been told he left. She had never believed it. She had kept the photo in a drawer, face worn from her own fingers. Another family brought a pocket watch found in their attic with a note. Belongs to Uncle Peter, last seen at the rail yard. Dr. Klein couldn't promise identification immediately. Time degrades bones. Records vanish. DNA is possible, but it requires living relatives and funding and patience. Still, the fact that people were bringing photos to the municipal hall changed the air. The dead were no longer anonymous. They were family. They were names, with stories attached. They were the kind of missing that had haunted households quietly for generations. And above the field, the vulture kept circling. It should have left once humans arrived, once the noise and vehicles disturbed the area. But it lingered at the edges. Some mornings it perched on a dead tree by the ditch, head angled, watching the slow work below as if it wanted to ensure the truth stayed uncovered. Wildlife rehab volunteers were asked if the bird was sick, if it needed to be captured. They said no. Vultures are drawn to death, yes, but they are also drawn to opportunity. Disturbed earth can expose insects, small carrion, things humans don't notice. The bird might have been feeding on small remains, on the ecosystem shift, on the subtle changes at the site. Or it might have been something simpler. It might have been that the vulture had found the field first, and it did not like being displaced. Milo, who had become the accidental first witness, watched it with an uneasy respect. He started reading about vultures at night, sitting at his kitchen table while his coffee went cold again. He learned that vultures can smell certain gases, can detect decay from distances that make human senses look almost comical. He learned that circling behavior can be a signal, a kind of aerial announcement. He learned quietly that the vulture had been doing what humans hadn't done for decades, paying attention. 2 weeks after the dig began, a storm came through. hard rain, wind that bent the poplars and made the ditch overflow. The field turned to mud. The forensic team covered the excavation with tarps and weighted edges. They worked late to protect the site. That night, Milo lay in bed listening to rain and felt a strange fear. Not of the weather, but of what weather does. It reveals, erodes, collapses. He wondered if the storm was what had triggered the vulture in the first place. Maybe the rain had softened the cap. Maybe it had exposed scent. Maybe a small sinkhole had opened and released what had been sealed. Maybe the field had tried to remain quiet and failed. The next morning, the vulture circled again, patient as ever. On day 16, Lena uncovered a second piece of evidence that made the case sharper and more painful. A length of wire. Not random wire, not debris. A twisted loop consistent with binding. Dr. Klein's team found it near wrist bones, positioned in a way that suggested restraint. That meant the victims had likely been detained, transported, and executed. Not fallen in battle, not collateral. This was organized violence. The national office moved quickly once the evidence reached a threshold. They searched military archives. They cross-referenced known militia units operating in the area during that time. They pulled names of officers and local collaborators. Most perpetrators were dead. That is often the bitter reality of late war crime investigations. Time protects criminals in a way the law cannot easily defeat. But not all of them. One name remained alive as the records. A man in his late 90s living in a private facility in another region. A former unit commander. A man who had been accused once before, decades earlier, and cleared due to insufficient evidence. Insufficient evidence had just been pulled from the ground. The town learned this through whispers first, then through a brief official statement that gave no name but confirmed the investigation was linked to command responsibility and unlawful executions. Some locals reacted with defensiveness, not because they supported the crime, but because they hated the idea that their town might be associated with it. People will protect a place like they protect a family member, even when the family member has done something unforgivable. Others reacted with a harsh relief. Finally, someone was naming it. Finally, the field's silence was being translated into language. In the middle of all this, Milo found himself pulled into a strange role. He wasn't an investigator. He wasn't a historian. He was just a municipal technician who had followed a bird and pushed a rod into soil. But Lena asked him to help in a way that made sense for who he was. She wanted him to trace old infrastructure. War crimes aren't always hidden only by fear. Sometimes they're hidden by bureaucracy. Land changes hands, rail spurs are removed, drainage is rerouted. If you want to understand how a site stayed undisturbed for decades, you look at the physical changes that made people avoid it without ever needing to be told. Milo walked the old rail line, now mostly a path with gravel and weeds. He found remnants, old ties half buried, rusted spikes, a subtle curve where the spur once branched toward the quiet field. He found, near the ditch, a concrete marker with a faint stamp, an old boundary marker from wartime engineering. It had been painted over once and then forgotten. Lena photographed it. Everything mattered now. Every scrap of the past that could be anchored to a physical location became part of the story that could hold up in court. The excavation continued for another week. Remains were recovered respectfully, packaged, transported for analysis. The field's center became a raw scar of open earth, framed by tape and guarded overnight. At the end of the third week, Dr. Klein held a small briefing. Not a press conference, not a spectacle. A statement for the town and the families. She confirmed the remains represented at least 30 individuals, likely civilians, likely executed. Evidence supported restraint and close-range gunfire. She also confirmed something else. The victims had been buried with haste, but also with care to conceal. The cap layer was deliberate. The trenches were aligned. Someone had understood even then that the world might one day look for this. That implied fear, or guilt, or both. Lena's work shifted to the legal side. She took the forensic findings and built a case that could survive scrutiny, because courts do not operate on emotion. They operate on proof. The National Office requested the reopening of the old investigation file. They requested witness testimony, including Doosan's. They requested archive records of the suspected unit. The surviving commander was questioned. He denied knowledge. He denied orders. He denied everything. Denial is common. It costs nothing in the moment and hopes time will do the rest. But time had already done its work. Time had preserved the field. Time had protected the bodies. Time had also left the perpetrator alive long enough to face the consequences. A month after the initial discovery, Milo returned to the field early in the morning. The forensic team had cleared out. The tape was down. The scar of earth had been backfilled, not restored but covered, the way a wound is covered with a clean bandage while it heals. A temporary memorial marker stood at the edge, simple, wooden, no names yet. Just an acknowledgement that something had been found here and that it mattered. The Vulture was gone. Milo stared at the empty sky and felt, oddly, that the bird's departure was a kind of closure, not moral closure. Nothing that happened here could be morally closed, but a closure in the sense that the messenger had delivered the message and moved on. The town didn't return to normal quickly. A place doesn't move on from a mass grave the way it moves on from a storm or a bad economic year. This kind of discovery changes the temperature of daily life. Conversations become sharper. Old family stories resurface. People who had avoided certain topics for decades suddenly find themselves unable to avoid them anymore. Families continued to submit DNA samples. Some matches came back months later. A name finally attached to a set of bones. Then another. Each identification was a small explosion in a household, relief and grief arriving together, untangling a knot that had sat in the dark for generations. The memorial marker grew into something more permanent. Names were added as identifications came in. Flowers appeared. Candles, sometimes. A folded letter left in the grass. The field was no longer the quiet field. It was a field with a voice now, even if that voice was made of stone and names and the absence of people who should have lived. A year later, the court proceedings concluded. The commander was found responsible under command authority for unlawful executions. He was sentenced, though the sentence, given his age, felt symbolic to some and overdue to others. Symbolic or not, the judgment mattered. It was an official statement that the dead were not rumors, not accidents, not casualties of chaos. They were victims of a crime. The town's relationship with its own history changed. Some people resisted. Some people leaned into it. The school added a unit on local wartime history, including uncomfortable details. The municipal hall placed copies of declassified records in the archive, accessible to the public. A small plaque was installed near the field's entrance. It didn't talk about heroes. It didn't glorify anything. It named the truth plainly. Milo kept thinking about the Vulture, especially on mornings when he drove past the field and saw sunlight on dew. He wondered how many years the bird, or its ancestors, had been circling that patch of ground. He wondered if there had been other warnings, animals avoiding the center, dogs refusing to go in, strange dips in soil after heavy rain. He wondered how many times humans had looked away because the past was heavy. And he wondered, with a kind of bitter honesty, if he would have looked away too if the Vulture hadn't made the pattern obvious. Because that's the thing about a quiet field. It stays quiet until something insists on making noise. In this case, the noise was not an explosion. It was not a confession. It was not a dramatic whistleblower stepping into the spotlight. It was a large, patient bird drawing circles over a forgotten patch of earth until a man who liked schedules and labeled panels finally thought, with uneasy clarity, that the bird was not hunting. It was pointing. The war crime had been buried with care. The secrecy had lasted a lifetime. The perpetrators had hoped the field would remain ordinary enough to be ignored. But nature has its own way of refusing to keep secrets. Soil shifts, rain erodes, scent travels, birds watch from above. And sometimes, rarely, maddeningly, almost impossibly, an animal's strange behavior becomes the first line of an investigation the humans should have started decades earlier. The Vulture did not belong to that field, but it was the one that finally made the field impossible to forget.